Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. I've got a really good one for you today. This one's going to be a little bit more in detail, but it has to answer a lot of questions I get from the viewers out there that are always asking me questions regarding fish activity mode. Are they in a hungry, aggressive mode, or are the fish in a sluggish mode where you need to generate the strikes through a reaction bait? And that's what I want to talk about today is the difference between the hunger strike and the reaction strike. And if you can determine if the fish are in an aggressive, hungry mood versus a lethargic mood where you have to generate the strikes through reaction baits, if you can determine the difference between those two, you can improve and increase your fishing on the water drastically. Meaning, if you identify that the fish are in an aggressive, hungry mood, you can catch double the number of bites without a doubt, in my opinion. If the fish are in a lethargic mode and you're not using the right baits and you're not presenting the baits in the correct manner, you could cut your bites in half. That's how important this is. This is something that a lot of people don't address, a lot of people don't fully understand, but I'm going to tell you some simple ways to identify whether the fish are aggressive or whether they are not aggressive and therefore not in a feeding mode, because it really makes a big difference. Is the earlier you can identify those two, the more bites you're going to get by making adjustments to it. So I'm going to tell you how to identify it, and I'm going to tell you what you can do to make adjustments to increase the number of bites that you're going to get while you're still on the water during those feeding windows. All right, so the first thing here, guys, is pretty simple. The first part of this whole equation is you got to identify what type of mood the fish are in. Are they in an aggressive, hungry mode? And if they are, how do you determine it? Well, it's pretty simple. The first thing you can do to determine this is see how they're responding to your bait on the fall. If a fish is in an aggressive mode, they are actively seeking out bait. They will go a long distance to bite your baits. So if you're getting a lot of bites on the initial fall, pretty much doesn't matter what bait you're throwing. If you're throwing a Texas rig and they're biting it on the fall, if you're throwing a crankbait or a topwater and they're almost instantly biting it, that's because that fish is coming at it at a rapid pace. So that's the first and most straightforward, easiest way to identify if they're in that hungry mode. So it's, are they biting on the initial fall? The next is, are you getting bit on just a simple straight retrieve with nothing else being changed in it? There is no change in cadence. Are you throwing a spinner bait, straight retrieving it back to the boat? Are you throwing a topwater, straight retrieving it back to the boat without creating any sort of change in your retrieve to generate that strike? And why that's important is if you're just casting a spinnerbait and straight retrieving it to the boat, if a fish is going to come eat that, that's because they're hungry and in an aggressive mood. So they're going to come for wherever to bite that bait. There's potential, yes, if you deflect it off a piece of grass, deflect it off a piece of wood, and the fish bite. At that point, I don't consider that a straight retrieve. I consider that you creating a reaction strike. It doesn't mean the fish aren't in an aggressive mood, but it also means you didn't do anything special to generate an additional bite on a straight retrieve. If you deflected off wood, you did, whether you liked it or not, did something special on the retrieve that could have generated that reaction strike. So that's why that's important. The third way that I use to identify whether fish are in an aggressive mood is how many times they bite your bait. Meaning, if you throw into a spot, you get bit, you set the hook, you miss the fish, you reel up, make the same cast again, they bite it again. Sometimes you catch them on the second cast. Sometimes you could throw in there 3, 4, 5, 6 times until you finally catch that fish. If they bite the bait multiple times, they are in an aggressive feeding mode. If you get a bite and you throw back in there and you cannot get that fish to bite again, chances are you generated that strike the initial time through a reactionary method. Whether they bit it just because you landed on top of them on the fall, whether you deflected your bait off a piece of wood and they swiped at it just out of their own instinctive nature, or whether it was just something where whatever you did, you triggered that strike through a change in retrieve. If you can't get them to come back, chances are that you did something on that first cast that triggered them. But because they're not actively feeding, they're not going to come back for a second go around of your bait or a third or a fourth go around. So that's how I identify whether they're active or not. You know, if you're getting bit on the fall, bit on a straight retrieve, and multiple bites from the same fish, they're probably very actively feeding. If you're getting, if you miss a strike and they only bite it the one time, and you can't get them to come back for the bait the second time, or you have to generate strikes through a change in retrieve method or generate strikes through deflection purposes, that would lead me to believe that they're more not in an aggressive feeding mode. It doesn't mean that they're not actively feeding or that there's any sort of weird change in pressure frontage. A lot of fish just aren't actively feeding. They're not in their own personal feeding window. So if you can identify whether they're actively feeding or not actively feeding, that's the biggest part of this equation. So once you've identified that they are in a feeding mode, what you want to do, in my opinion, is cover as much water as possible. If fish are coming out of nowhere to bite your bait on a straight retrieve, think of how many fish you can come in contact with by covering a lot of water. You want to fish high percentage areas, but you want to run and gun as many spots as you can, because while that feeding window is occurring, the more fish that you can come in contact with, the more likely is you're going to get a good percentage of those fish to bite. So you want to pick up your fast moving baits, a top water, your spinner bait. You know, you don't necessarily need to slow down with a finesse bait because they're going to eat the finesse bait as well as the spinner bait. So I'd rather throw the spinner bait or a top water and just cover water as fast as possible to come in contact with as many of those aggressive fish as possible. If you've determined that they're not in an aggressively active feeding mode, that's when you need to slow down. You need to do a couple of things. The first is you want to probably throw either a straight reactionary style bait. And what I mean by that is something that you can deflect off of wood, off of rock, rip out of grass. You need to do something different with the bait. You want a bait that will trigger the strike. So if you've got maybe a lipless crankbait that you can rip through grass, a crankbait where you can pound it off rocks, deflect it off wood, if you can throw, a jig, but maybe you're stroking the jig versus just kind of feathering it through logs as you might normally do. So maybe you're out fishing offshore and you stroking the jig to create that reactionary strike on the bait because the fish thinks that that jig is trying to get away. Those are really important things. At the same time, you can slow down and go with your finesse presentations. The finesse presentations are key because it's that whole idea of putting like a cookie in front of somebody who's not really hungry. I'll eat a cookie if you put a cookie in front of me, whether I just ate dinner or didn't eat dinner. So finesse is always going to be a decent go around when the fish are not in an actively feeding mode. But regardless of whether you're throwing finesse or you're throwing reactionary style baits, you want to be fishing the high percentage places, and you probably want to make a few additional casts. So what I mean by that is if you have a brush pile found or a stump found or a little rock pile found, when the fish are really aggressive, you might need to make 2 casts to that rock pile or that brush pile, and the fish will come out of the brush pile and eat the bait. If you've identified that they're not in an active feeding period, it's probably worth making 10, 15, 20 casts to a brush pile if you're confident that there's fish there. Because what you need to do is probably make the right cast where that bait almost falls directly in front of the fish to create that reaction bite. So it's important to notice that there's big differences between these two. The bait choices are also important. You know, if the fish are in a very aggressive mode, they're gonna bite almost anything. So at that point, pick up the baits that are going to generate the bigger strikes and pick up the baits that are going to allow you to cover a lot more water. If the fish are not in aggressive mode, pick up your smaller finesse baits or pick up your baits that you can impart action to, either through your retrieve, meaning you can change up the retrieve just by rod motion and by the reel turn handles. You're doing things to change up that bait movement. Or you want baits that can deflect off objects, rip through the weeds, things that will create that reaction bite. I'm telling you guys, if you pay attention next time you go out on the water to whether the fish are actively feeding or not actively feeding, and you can determine that based on your own presentation of baits, you will become a much more efficient angler on the water, and you will be able to significantly increase the number of bites that you get throughout the day. So I hope this was helpful, guys. This is something that it's taken me years to learn, but I feel like I've honed it in, and this is something that's allowed me to become a successful professional angler. And it's something that I'm sharing with you that I never have had anyone tell me about, but it's something that I think is valuable to help you guys catch a few more fish. So hopefully it was helpful. If it was, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and stay tuned. We'll have another video coming out tomorrow.